For 10 years, the only sound Jedediah trusted was the wind. It spoke a language of truth, howling warnings of winter or whispering promises of a thaw. It never lied. Men, however, built their entire world on lies, which was why Jedediah had left that world behind. His ranch was a fortress of solitude, nestled in a high-walled canyon that discouraged visitors and taxmen alike. His only conversations were with his 2 horses, Abraham and Isaac, and they were mostly one-sided affairs about the miserable quality of last year's oats. His routine was a silent prayer. Wake before the sun, check the perimeter fence he'd built strong enough to stop a charging bull, tend to the animals, and then spend the day in the slow, meditative work of a man hiding from his own memories, mending leather, sharpening tools, oiling the rifle he never fired. The rifle was a relic, same as the man who owned it. Both had seen too much use and were now meant to be at peace. Tonight the wind was angry. It clawed at the stout timbers of his cabin, a prelude to a storm that was gathering its breath in the black peaks to the west. Jedediah was laying a new log on the fire when a different sound cut through the gale. It was sharp, unnatural, a sound he hadn't heard in this valley since he'd arrived. A single gunshot. It wasn't the heavy boom of a hunting rifle chasing deer, nor the panicked pop of a traveler warding off a coyote. This was the flat, cold crack of a pistol, the kind of sound a man makes when he's trying to kill another man. Jedediah froze, his hand hovering over the hearth. Abraham whinnied nervously from the barn, a high, thin sound of distress. Jedediah straightened up, his body tensing with an ancient, unwelcome familiarity. He moved to the window, peering through the rain-streaked glass. There was nothing but darkness and the thrashing skeletons of aspens. The shot had come from the east, from the direction of the old Miller place, a scrabble of land so poor and water-starved that nobody had bothered with it for 20 years, until a few months ago. A girl, they said, down in the town of Redemption. The one time a year he went for salt and flour. A niece of old man Miller, come to claim her inheritance. He'd heard the whispers. A young woman, alone. Fools talked of her beauty, but Jedediah had only thought of her foolishness. This was no country for a lone woman. He told himself it was none of his business. He had built these walls, both stone and silence, for a reason. He was done. The man who would have once ridden toward the sound of a gun was buried, 6 feet deep in the past. He turned from the window, intending to sit back down, to add another log to the fire, to wait for the wind to swallow the memory of the sound. But then he saw it. A flicker of orange against the dark belly of the clouds in the east. Not a lantern. It was the hungry, greedy light of a real fire. The Miller place was burning. Jedediah stood motionless for a full minute, a statue of indecision. Helping was a choice. A door once opened could not be easily closed. He looked at his hands. They were calloused and steady from ranch work, but he remembered when they were steady for other reasons. He closed his eyes, and for a fleeting moment, he wasn't in his cabin. He was back in the mud and the blood, with the screams of dying men in his ears. He shook his head, a violent shudder to cast the ghosts away. To hell with it. Maybe it was a lightning strike. Maybe the girl had been careless with a lamp. It was not his fight. He walked to the barn. Abraham and Isaac greeted him with low rumbles. "Just checking on you boys," he murmured, his voice raspy from disuse. He ran a hand along Abraham's powerful neck. The horse was still agitated, his eyes wide. Animals knew. They felt the wrongness in the air. As Jedediah turned to leave, his gaze fell upon the saddle slung over a rail. Beside it, coiled like a serpent, was a bullwhip, and next to that, in a worn leather holster, was the Colt revolver he hadn't touched in a decade. He ran his fingers over the dusty leather, a current of something electric and terrible jolting through him. He snatched his hand back as if burned. No, he would not become that man again. He would not. He bolted the barn door from the outside and strode back toward the cabin, his jaw set, his boots crunching in the muddy yard. He would not go. He would bar his own door and let the world burn if it wished. He was halfway to his porch when the first fat, cold drops of rain began to fall, and in the wind another sound carried to him, fainter than the gunshot, more desperate than the fire. It was a cry, a human voice, thin and terrified, ripped to shreds by the rising gale. Jedediah stopped dead, his head bowed against the rain. The cry came again, closer this time, a woman's scream. He lifted his head, the rain plastering his graying hair to his forehead, and looked toward the darkness that had spit out the sound. The silent prayer of his routine was broken. The fortress of his solitude had been breached. The man he had buried was beginning to stir. He found her collapsed at the edge of his property line, caught in the thorns of a greasewood bush like a wounded bird. Her dress was torn and blackened with soot, one shoulder bare and bleeding from a deep scrape. Her face was smudged with ash, tracks of clean skin carved by tears. She was shivering, not just from the cold, but from a terror so profound it seemed to have hollowed her out. When she saw him, a figure of shadow emerging from the deluge, she flinched and tried to crawl away. "Stay back," she rasped, her voice raw. Jedediah stopped, holding his hands up, palms out. "I'm not going to hurt you, ma'am. I live here. I heard the shot." Her eyes, wide and wild in the darkness, darted from his face to the faint glow of his cabin behind him. She was young, younger than he'd imagined, barely out of her teens. Her name was Ilara. She choked out between sobs. She'd inherited the farm. She'd tried to make a go of it. "What happened?" Jedediah asked, his voice gentle, a tone he hadn't used in years. "Men," she whispered, pulling a torn piece of her dress tighter around her shoulder. "They came for me, from the Croft cattle empire. They want my land." The name fell like a stone in the stormy silence between them. Silas Croft, a man whose name was a brand on the entire territory. He owned senators, sheriffs, and seemingly the sun and moon. His greed was a force of nature, patient and absolute. "He made me an offer last week," Ilara continued, her teeth chattering. "Said my land was worthless, but he'd take it off my hands for a pittance, for my own good. I refused. I told him it was all I had left of my family." She took a shuddering breath. "He told me I'd regret it. Tonight, his foreman, a man named Pike, came to collect. They didn't even speak. They just started shooting. They set my home on fire." Jedediah's gaze drifted past her, back toward the angry orange glow that was now being beaten down by the torrential rain. His land, his sanctuary, had a border. On his side was peace. On hers, the world he had fled. She was a piece of that world, washed up on his shore, bringing the storm with her. "Please," she begged, her voice cracking. "I saw your light. You're my only hope. They'll be back. Pike said he'd hunt me down like a dog." Here it was, the moral test, the choice he had been avoiding for a decade. He could tend to her wounds, give her a blanket and a piece of bread, and send her on her way come morning, point her toward the town of redemption, a full day's ride from here, and wish her luck. That was the safe choice. The choice that would let him keep his solitude intact, or he could let her in, let her bring her war into his home. He looked at her, trembling and pathetic in the mud, and he didn't just see a stranger. He saw a reflection of every innocent person he had failed to protect, every victim whose face haunted his sleepless nights. Her vulnerability was a mirror to his own past failures. From the darkness behind her, down the canyon, came the sound of approaching horses. Not the slow, steady pace of travelers, but the aggressive, impatient trot of hunters. A man's voice, coarse and arrogant, bellowed a name. "Ilara, you can't hide, girl! We know you're out here!" Ilara flinched as if struck, a small cry of pure terror escaping her lips. She looked at Jedediah, her eyes pleading, conveying a desperation that transcended words. It was the look of someone with no moves left to make, cornered by a predator. Jedediah's jaw hardened. The choice was no longer his to make. It had been made for him. He stepped forward, his shadow falling over her. He reached down, not with the gentle hand of a comforter, but with the firm grip of a soldier. He pulled her to her feet. "Come on," he said, his voice now flat and hard, stripped of all its earlier gentleness. "Get to the cabin, and stay away from the windows." He guided her through the rain, his mind already shifting, the gears of a machine he'd tried to dismantle grinding back to life. He wasn't just offering shelter. He was accepting a battle. The sanctuary was about to become a fortress again. Inside the cabin, the warmth of the fire was a stark contrast to the howling chaos outside. Ilara huddled by the hearth, wrapped in a thick wool blanket, shivering uncontrollably. Jedediah ignored her. His movements were precise, economical, and devoid of emotion. He walked to a large, dust-covered chest in the corner, a chest he hadn't opened since the day he'd arrived. The lock was stiff, but it yielded with a groan of protest. Inside, beneath a layer of yellowed newspapers, lay the tools of his former life. The Colt, nestled in its holster, 2 boxes of ammunition, a long, wicked-looking knife with a blade of dark, storied steel. He strapped the gun belt around his waist. The weight of it was both sickening and familiar. A phantom limb reattached. He checked the cylinder, the metallic clicks loud in the tense silence of the room. It was fully loaded. Ilara watched him, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and something else. Awe, perhaps. What are you going to do? They won't stop at the fence, Jedediah said, not looking at her. He was speaking to himself as much as to her. A man like Pike, he sees a lone cabin as an easy target. He'll assume it's just you and me. He'll be arrogant. He walked to the main door and slid a heavy iron bar into place. He did the same for the thick wooden shutters on the windows. The cabin was plunged into near-total darkness, save for the flickering firelight. He's underestimating us, Jedediah continued, his voice a low growl. That's his first mistake. He picked up his old rifle from its place above the mantelpiece. It'll be his last. The sounds from outside grew clearer. Hoofbeats splashing in the mud, the jingle of harnesses, the low, guttural laughter of cruel men confident in their work. They had surrounded the cabin. Jedediah. The shout was right outside the door. It was Pike. His voice was a sneer-given sound. I know you're in there, old man, and I know you have something that belongs to Mr. Croft. Send the girl out, and we'll leave you to your pathetic existence. Refuse, and we'll burn this shack to the ground with you in it. Ilara gasped, pressing a hand to her mouth. She looked at Jedediah, her face a mask of terror. Don't let them take me, she whimpered. Jedediah didn't answer. He moved to a small slit in one of the shutters, a firing port he'd carved years ago and never used. He peered out. He could see them, 6 of them, mounted figures made monstrous by the lashing rain and wavering lantern light. Pike was at the front, a big man with a piggish face, sitting on his horse as if it were a throne. You have 1 minute, old man, Pike bellowed, his arrogance a tangible thing. Jedediah watched them, his breathing slow and even. The storm outside was a symphony of chaos, but inside him, a terrible calm had settled. He was no longer the hermit. He was no longer the farmer. The man he had tried to kill for 10 years was back, and he was staring down the barrel of a rifle. Ilara, still huddled by the fire, suddenly spoke, her voice barely a whisper but sharp with an odd clarity. They're too spread out for a frontal charge, but the 2 on the left, their horses are nervous. They're closest to the gorge. A loud noise from that direction might spook them. Jedediah glanced back at her, surprised. It was a sound, tactical observation, an unlikely thing for a terrified farm girl to notice. He saw her eyes reflecting the firelight. For a second, the fear in them was gone, replaced by a glint of cold, hard intelligence. It was there and then gone, so fast he thought he'd imagined it. The terrified girl was back, her shoulders shaking. He dismissed it. A lucky guess. He turned his attention back to the men outside. She was right about the horses. He'd use that. Last chance, Pike yelled. Jedediah raised the rifle to his shoulder, the smooth wood cool against his cheek. He didn't answer with words. He answered with fire. The rifle bucked against his shoulder, its roar temporarily deafening the storm. Outside, one of the lanterns exploded in a shower of glass and flame. In the sudden darkness and confusion, Jedediah worked the lever action, the smooth snick-clack of the mechanism a deadly rhythm. He fired again. One of the riders screamed and tumbled from his saddle. As Ilara had predicted, the 2 horses on the left, already skittish, reared in panic. Their riders fought for control, but it was too late. With another booming shot from the cabin that struck the rock face near them, the horses bolted, shrieking with terror, and disappeared into the rainy darkness toward the gorge. 2 more men gone without him, even aiming at them. Spread out! Find cover, you fools! Pike roared, his voice now laced with fury instead of arrogance. He swung off his horse and dived behind the water trough, firing his own pistol wildly at the cabin. Bullets thudded harmlessly into the thick logs. Jedediah moved from the window to a different firing port, his movements fluid and practiced. He was a ghost in his own home, a phantom of vengeance. The remaining 2 thugs had taken cover behind a rocky outcrop, firing sporadically. They were pinned. They were afraid. The fight became a deadly game of cat and mouse. The storm raged, muffling sounds, making every shadow a potential threat. Jedediah used the environment he knew better than his own skin. He was patient. He waited for a flash of lightning to illuminate a target, for a man to grow impatient and expose himself. One by one, he picked them off. A grunt, a cry cut short, the heavy slump of a body hitting the mud. Soon, there was only silence, broken by the wind. the rain, and the terrified whimpering of Pike's horse. Pike himself was still hidden behind the trough, pinned and alone. "You're a dead man, you hear me?" Pike screamed, his voice cracking with a fear he could no longer conceal. "Mr. Croft will send 100 men. 1,000. He'll salt the earth where this cabin stands." Jedediah didn't respond. He slipped out the back door of the cabin, a door that was little more than a disguised panel in the rear wall. He moved like a wraith through the deluge, circling around the barn, the mud sucking at his boots. He was the predator now, and Pike was the cornered prey. He came up behind the trough, his revolver in his hand, the hammer cocked back with a soft, deadly click. Pike was reloading, his hands shaking, his back to Jedediah. He never even heard him approach over the roar of the storm. "You made a mistake coming here." Jedediah's voice was low, right behind him. Pike froze. He dropped his pistol and slowly, very slowly, turned around. His face was pale. His arrogant sneer melted away into a mask of disbelief and primal fear. He stared up at the grim, rain-slicked figure looming over him, a man who looked more like an executioner than a hermit. "Please," Pike stammered. "It was just a job. Croft will pay you. He'll pay you double what he pays me." Jedediah looked down at the man, his eyes as cold and empty as a winter sky. He saw in Pike's face the face of every bully, every tyrant who believed their power gave them the right to ruin the lives of others. He thought of Alara's burned-down home, of the 10 years of peace this man had shattered in a single night. He didn't pull the trigger. That would be too quick. He uncoiled the bullwhip from his belt. The lightning flashed, illuminating the long leather tail as he swung it back. The whip cracked, a sound sharper and more final than any gunshot. Pike screamed, a raw, agonized sound that was swallowed by a peal of thunder. Jedediah returned to the cabin, drenched and breathing heavily. He barred the back door and leaned against it, the adrenaline slowly beginning to recede, leaving a familiar, bitter exhaustion in its wake. He had done it. He had faced the violence he ran from, and he had won. Alara was on her feet staring at him. The fear was gone from her face, replaced with a look of stunned reverence. "It's over?" she asked, her voice a whisper. "It's over," Jedediah confirmed, his voice flat. He walked to the fire, the Colt still heavy in his hand. For now, he had repelled the first wave. He had sent a message to Silas Croft. For the first time in a decade, he felt a flicker of something that wasn't shame or regret. It might have been pride. He and Alara stood in silence for a long moment, the only sound the spitting fire and the drumming of the lessening rain on the roof. The storm was passing. They had survived. A sense of hard-won victory settled over the small cabin. It was Alara who heard it first, her head tilted, her expression changing. The awe vanished, replaced by an intense, focused listening. "What is it?" Jedediah asked, tensing again. "Listen," she said, her voice taut. He strained his ears, listening past the rain. And then he heard it, a sound that made the hairs on his arms stand up, a sound that chilled him far more than the storm ever could. It wasn't the sound of a few riders. It was a low, continuous rumble that vibrated up through the floorboards. It was the sound of dozens of horses, moving at a steady, disciplined pace. It was the sound of an army. Jedediah rushed to the firing slit and peered out. On the ridge opposite the canyon, a light appeared, then another next to it, and another. Torches, stretching in a long, unbroken line along the entire length of the ridge, their flames defiant against the dying rain. More lights appeared on the ridge to the south, and then to the north, until his entire canyon, his entire fortress, was ringed with a constellation of malevolent fire. Pike hadn't been lying. Croft hadn't sent his foreman to bully a girl. He had sent him to flush her out, to find where she would run. Pike wasn't the attack. He was the scout, the bait, and Jedediah had taken it. He slowly backed away from the window, a horrifying understanding dawning on his face. This wasn't a punishment for sheltering a refugee. This was a siege. They had been herded into this cabin, this perfect isolated kill box. His sanctuary had become his tomb. He turned to look at Alara, to see the terror he felt reflected in her eyes. But she wasn't looking at him. She was staring at the fires on the ridge, her back to him. The blanket had fallen from her shoulders. She stood tall, her posture no longer that of a victim, but of a commander surveying a battlefield. And on her face, in the flickering light of the fire, was not fear. It was a cold, grim, and terrifying smile. The flickering firelight carved sharp angles on her face, turning her triumphant smile into something predatory. The girl who had collapsed in the mud, the picture of innocence and terror, was gone. In her place stood a woman of chilling composure. Jedediah took a half-step back, the Colt in his hand suddenly feeling like a foreign object. "What is this?" he growled, his voice a low rumble of betrayal. "Who are you?" "My name is Alara," she said, her voice now steady and clear, all trace of its earlier desperation gone. "And my father was Marcus Miller, not my uncle, my father. Silas Croft didn't just make him a poor offer for this land 10 years ago. He had his men murder my father and mother in their sleep and burn the original cabin to the ground, passing it off as a tragic accident. I was a child, sent away to live with relatives. I was the only thing he overlooked." She turned to face him fully, her eyes boring into his. "My inheritance isn't this worthless patch of rock and dust, Jedediah. It's a debt, a blood debt, and tonight I've come to collect." The pieces fell into place with sickening speed. Her tactical observation about the horses, the way she'd led Pike's men directly to his doorstep, it had all been a performance. He hadn't rescued a victim. He'd been recruited into a war. "You used me," he said, the words tasting like ash. "You lied to me. I told you men came for my land." She countered, her gaze unwavering. "I told you they burned my home. I told you Pike would hunt me down. Was any of it untrue? I showed you a wounded bird, and you chose to protect it. That choice, Jedediah, was yours and yours alone. It was the only part of this I couldn't plan for. I gambled that the man who built a fortress to hide from the world still remembered why he had to build it in the first place. I gambled that a good man was still living inside." The army of torches on the ridges seemed to press in on the small cabin, a silent, suffocating promise of violence. "That's 100 men out there," Jedediah said, his gaze flicking back toward the firing slit. "Maybe more. They're not waiting. They're surrounding us. We're trapped." "They are waiting," Alara corrected him. "They're waiting for Silas Croft himself. He's on his way from his grand estate. He wants a front row seat for the finale. He wants to watch the last of the Miller line be extinguished personally. His vanity is the only weapon we have left." Jedediah stared at her, caught between fury and a dawning, terrible respect. She had orchestrated this entire night, maneuvering pieces on a chessboard he hadn't even known existed. She had willingly painted a target on her own back to draw the king out into the open. "What good does that do?" he demanded. "He'll watch us die, and then ride home for a warm breakfast." "He will if we are the only players," she said, a new, intense light in her eyes. "But we aren't. Jedediah, this canyon is the stage. The real battle is happening somewhere else right now." She took a deep breath. "For 5 years I've been traveling this territory, not as a warrior, but as a whisper. I've visited every small rancher, every farmer, every blacksmith and shopkeeper that Croft has bled dry. I've listened to their stories. I've collected their anger and their fear, and tried to forge it into a weapon." She pointed a finger toward the east, in the direction of the distant town. "That weapon is redemption." Jedediah let out a bitter laugh. "Redemption? That town is a ghost. It's full of cowards who bow and scrape every time one of Croft's men rides down their street. They bow because they have no choice," Alara shot back. "They're lambs surrounded by wolves. A single lamb that stands up gets slaughtered, but 100 lambs, moving as one, they can cause a stampede. They've been waiting, Jedediah, waiting for a signal, waiting for proof that Croft is not invincible." "And what's the signal?" he asked, though he already suspected the answer. "Pike's failed attack. The news will have reached town by now, carried by the men who fled. They will report that the hermit of the canyon fought back, that Croft's invincible foreman was defeated by one old man. It's the spark, but a spark needs fuel to become an inferno. That's our job. We have to give them time. We have to hold this canyon until dawn." His anger began to cool, replaced by the cold, clear logic of a battlefield commander. He had been a pawn, yes, but he was now on the board. He looked from Alara's determined face to the ring of fire outside. He had run from this his whole life, from responsibility, from the fight. He had built his peace on the belief that one man couldn't make a difference, and this young woman, fueled by nothing but grief and righteous fury, was trying to prove that one person could rally 100. "What's the plan in town?" he asked, the question itself an oath of allegiance. "Croft's power isn't in his men," she explained, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "It's in his books. a set of ledgers he keeps locked in a safe in the sheriff's office. They detail every illegal land grab, every threat, every bribe he's ever paid. It's the blueprint of his entire criminal empire. While he's here watching us, my allies in town are going to march on that office, liberate those ledgers, and take back the law. The sheriff, Jedediah scoffed. Sheriff Brody is Croft's personal lapdog. He'll shoot the first man who tries to get through his door. A sad, knowing look crossed Ilara's face. Sheriff Brody's wife died 2 winters ago because he couldn't afford the doctor from the next county. Croft owns the only doctor in Redemption, and he decided Brody wasn't important enough to save her. A man can stomach his own humiliation for a long time, but some wounds, they never stop bleeding. He's the one who told me where the ledgers were. He's been waiting longer than anyone. It was the first twist of the knife. The timid, sycophantic sheriff, a secret revolutionary. Jedediah felt the ground shift beneath his feet. The world he thought he knew, the one he had dismissed as simple and corrupt, was far more complex. He moved to the back of the cabin, his mind racing. Holding them until dawn is impossible. They'll charge us, overwhelm us. Not if they think we're more than we are, Ilara said, her mind clearly working in tandem with his. Not if we make this canyon a death trap. For the next hour, they worked in a grim, silent partnership. They weren't a hermit and a farm girl anymore. They were 2 soldiers preparing a defense. Jedediah, with his intimate knowledge of every rock and ravine, became the architect of their strategy. Ilara, with her fierce resolve, was the unflinching second in command. He had them move the heavy oak table to brace the main door. He showed her how to load the spare rifle. From his chest of tools he pulled out spools of tripwire and heavy iron spikes intended for mending fences. Under the cover of the barn, he and Ilara worked feverishly, rigging traps in the narrow passages leading to the cabin. A deadfall made of heavy logs, positioned above the main approach. Tripwires connected to stacks of noisy pots and pans inside the barn, designed to create phantom sounds and draw fire. As the first hint of gray began to lighten the eastern sky, a new figure appeared on the main ridge. He was mounted on a magnificent black stallion, a stark silhouette against the torchlight. Even from a distance, his presence was immense. Silas Croft had arrived. A horn blew, a single arrogant note that echoed through the canyon. The attack was beginning. The first wave of men came on foot, advancing cautiously up the main path toward the cabin. They moved in a crouch, rifles at the ready. "Wait for it," Jedediah murmured, his eye pressed to the firing slit. Ilara stood beside him, rifle clutched tightly, her knuckles white. The lead man stepped over a barely visible line in the mud. For a second, nothing happened. Then, with a groan of tortured rope, the deadfall trap sprang. A cascade of heavy logs and rocks crashed down onto the path, burying the first 4 men in a brutal, decisive instant. Cries of shock and pain erupted from the attackers. The others scrambled for cover, firing blindly toward the cabin. Their assault had been broken before it had even truly begun. From the ridges, Croft's furious voice bellowed, "You imbeciles! He's 1 man! Charge him! I want his head!" The next wave came from the flanks, trying to use the rocks and trees for cover. This time, Jedediah was ready. He and Ilara opened fire, not with a wild barrage, but with single, carefully placed shots. A man would peer from behind a rock, and a rifle crack would send him tumbling. They created an illusion of multiple skilled marksmen positioned all around the cabin. The attackers' confidence began to waver. They had expected a simple execution. Instead, they had stumbled into a carefully prepared killing ground. They were fighting ghosts. The canyon itself seemed to have turned against them. Then came the fire. Croft, enraged and impatient, ordered his men to use fire arrows. Flaming projectiles arced through the air, thudding into the cabin's roof and walls. The dry timber, soaked by the earlier rain, was slow to catch, but small fires began to smolder. "This is it," Jedediah said, grabbing a bucket of water. "They're trying to burn us out." As he worked to douse the flames, Ilara suddenly grabbed his arm. "Wait, Jedediah, the barn, all that dry hay, it's the fuel we need." He understood immediately. It wasn't just fuel. It was the signal, the inferno. He looked at her, then at his barn, a structure he had built with his own 2 hands. It was part of his sanctuary. He nodded grimly. "It's just wood." Under the cover of the cabin, he slipped out the back. Ilara laid down, suppressing fire, her shots now coming faster, more desperate, forcing the attackers to keep their heads down. Jedediah sprinted to the barn, a lit torch in his hand. He didn't hesitate. He thrust the flame into the largest pile of hay. The effect was instantaneous and spectacular. The dry hay erupted in a massive fireball, a whoosh of sound and heat that illuminated the entire canyon. Flames shot 50 feet into the air, turning the pre-dawn gloom into a horrifying, brilliant day. The barn became a colossal pyre, a beacon of defiance that could be seen for miles. Down in the town of Redemption, Sheriff Brody stood by his window, watching the eastern sky. He had seen the first, smaller glow from the Miller Place fire. He had heard the reports from Croft's routed men. He had felt the familiar grip of fear constricting his chest. For 5 years, he had worn the mask of a coward, enduring the town's scorn, Croft's contempt, all while secretly feeding information to the fierce young woman who carried the weight of their collective hope. Then he saw it. A new light bloomed on the horizon, vast and impossibly bright. The inferno, the final signal. He straightened his back, the stoop of a beaten man falling away. He strapped on his gun belt, the metal cool and reassuring. He walked out of his office and into the muddy main street. The blacksmith, a mountain of a man named Thomas, was waiting for him, a heavy sledgehammer resting on his shoulder. The general store owner, old Mr. Abernathy, stood with a shotgun held awkwardly in his shaking hands. One by one, from homes and shops, others emerged. Men and women, old and young. They were not an army. They were a congregation. Their faces were pale with fear, but their eyes burned with a desperate, unified resolve. This was the second twist, the one Croft could never have predicted. The community's silence hadn't been fear. It had been a promise. Their whispered conversations hadn't been gossip. They had been the weaving of a conspiracy. Their collective subservience had been the greatest performance of all. "It's time," Brody said, his voice ringing with an authority no one had ever heard from him before. They marched as one body toward the sheriff's office, which also served as Croft's administrative hub. 2 of Croft's paid thugs stood guard outside, looking bored. Their expressions turned to confusion, then alarm, as the silent crowd of townspeople advanced on them. "What is this, Brody?" one of them sneered. "Get these folks back in their homes." Brody didn't stop walking. "This town is done taking orders from you, or from Silas Croft. Step aside." The thug laughed and drew his pistol. "You've lost your mind, old m—" He never finished the sentence. Thomas the blacksmith's sledgehammer swung in a whistling arc, catching the man's gun hand and sending the pistol flying. The second guard, seeing the look in the eyes of 100 people who had nothing left to lose, dropped his weapon and ran. Thomas smashed the lock on the office door with a single mighty blow. Inside, the safe stood against the far wall, squat and impenetrable. "Stand back," Thomas grunted. He swung the sledgehammer, and the sound of steel striking steel rang through the town like a bell of liberation. Back in the canyon, the fire had thrown Croft's men into disarray. The sheer scale of the blaze was terrifying, unnatural. It looked like the mouth of hell had opened. They were no longer attacking a cabin. They were fighting a force of nature. Their morale shattered. Silas Croft, watching from the ridge, was apoplectic. This was not the neat, tidy execution he had envisioned. It was a chaotic, embarrassing mess. He spurred his horse down the trail, intending to take personal command and drive his men forward. That's when he saw Jedediah, not hiding in the cabin, but walking out of the smoke and embers, the long bullwhip coiled in his hand. Jedediah looked like a demon summoned by the fire, his face blackened with soot, his eyes glowing with cold fury. Croft's men fell back, a superstitious fear taking hold of them. "You!" Croft bellowed, reining in his horse. He drew a silver-plated revolver from his coat. "I'll kill you myself." He aimed and fired, but his horse, spooked by the fire and the sudden appearance of the man from the smoke, shied at the last second. The shot went wide. Before he could fire again, Jedediah's whip cracked through the air, the leather tail wrapped around Croft's gun hand. Jedediah yanked, and the expensive pistol was ripped from Croft's grasp, landing in the mud. Croft stared at his empty hand in disbelief. "This is my valley, Croft," Jedediah said, his voice dangerously calm. "My home? You are not welcome here." At that moment, a lone rider appeared, galloping frantically up the canyon path from the east. It was one of the guards who had fled Redemption. He reined his horse to a skidding halt before Croft. "Sir, it's the town. They've risen up. Brody, they've broken into the office. They're going for the ledgers." The blood drained from Silas Croft's face. The ledgers. His entire empire, his invincibility, was ink on paper in that safe. He looked from the rider to the burning barn, to the implacable figure of Jedediah walking toward him. He understood. It was all connected. He had been outmaneuvered. His men heard the news. Their loyalty was to Croft's money and power. With that power now in jeopardy, their will to fight for him in this cursed canyon evaporated completely. They began to mount their horses, melting away into the hills. Within minutes, Silas Croft was alone, facing Jedediah, with Alara emerging from the cabin, rifle in hand, to stand beside him. Croft was a wolf who had been stripped of his pack. He was just a man, a scared, desperate man. "This changes nothing," he snarled, trying to regain a sliver of his authority. "I still have friends. I'll own this territory again within a year." "No, you won't," a new voice said. Sheriff Brody rode into the clearing, flanked by Thomas the blacksmith and a dozen other men from Redemption, now armed and deputized. Brody was holding a heavy, leather-bound ledger. "Silas Croft," Brody said, his voice clear and strong, echoing in the quiet canyon. "By the authority of the people of this territory, and the evidence contained in this book, I am placing you under arrest for fraud, extortion, and the murders of Marcus and Annalise Miller." Croft looked at the faces surrounding him. There was no fear in them, only justice. His empire had crumbled to dust in a single night. His reign was over. Jedediah watched as they led Croft away in irons. He felt the tension of the last 10 years. The weight of the ghosts he carried finally began to lift. He hadn't just fought for his solitude. He had fought for a community. He hadn't just defended a piece of land. He had helped reclaim a future. He turned to Alara. She was looking at the smoldering ruins of his barn, her expression full of remorse. "I'm sorry, Jedediah, for your home." Jedediah looked at the blackened timbers, then at the faces of the people from Redemption, already talking about rebuilding, about the future. He looked at the walls of his canyon, no longer a prison, but a shelter for a newfound hope. "It was just wood and nails," he said, a small, genuine smile touching his lips for the first time in a decade. "We can always build it again, together." He had spent 10 years trusting only the wind, but as the sun finally crested the ridge, bathing the canyon in the clean light of a new day, he learned a deeper truth. The strength of one man can light a spark, but it is the courage of a community that fans it into a flame, a fire powerful enough to burn away the darkness and welcome the dawn. The spirit of the West lives on in tales like these. To hear more stories of unlikely heroes and the communities that rise with them, subscribe to our channel and become a guardian of their legacy.